it started passing these laws. And one right after another, the laws are just published in a set of books called the United States Statutes at Large. Now, you can go to a law library, and if you're going to look at these original laws of the United States Congress, they're going to be on rows and rows and rows of books. Now, if we had all of the United States Statutes at Large here in this room, they would say, see where that indentation is over there? You know, let's just imagine, from that wall, taking all of that wall right there, you would have a nice set of federal books, United States Statutes at Large, and in them you can pull out, you know, one volume, and you can see how the laws that Congress enacts are just placed there, one right after another. And the way you find a particular law when you're looking at, you know, if you're reading a case or if you're reading some legal treatise, how you find a particular federal law if they're making a citation to the United States Statutes at Large. The first number is the volume number, which you can see on the spine of a book. It'll have, you know, like 12 stat, S-T-A-T. That stands for that's an abbreviation for the statutes at large. And then the second number beyond that is the page where that law appears or that act of Congress appears. So you can turn to page of a law cited as 12 Stat 432, and what you'll find is one of the legal tender acts of Congress passed during the Civil War. Now, all of those laws that you can see along a wall if you were in a law library, all of the public laws are in that stack of books as Steve, the stack of CDs as Steve was describing during the course of his presentation. And I strongly encourage people to, you know, one of the things that I think is real important in this movement is for people to be conversant. You know, a lot of this battle against the system is a legal battle. You know, to me, there's three parts or three prongs of what we're trying to fight, you know, against abusive government. We have the public relations prong, and a lot of people are interested in that prong. You know, we need to be going out and presenting our issues to the public at large through this public relations function. That's one way that we can carry out this battle. Another way we can carry out this battle is what I call the legislative proposition. You know, we can have a whole bunch of people like Phil Hart who were involved in, you know, Phil Hart was an Idaho legislator. We have a number of other people that are in the legislature, one of whom was Ron Paul. You know, we could have people in our movement contacting public officials in the legislative branch and trying to explain to them, you know, we've got some problem, we'd like it to be legislatively addressed. That's another prong of this movement. A third prong of this movement does involve law. You know, we have people here that are concerned about the tax issue. We have people here that are concerned about the money issue. You know, based on our studies, you know, like in reference to the money issue, a lot of people can study a lot of real important works. And one important work that I think is real important that people should study is Edwin Vieira's book called Pieces of Eight. Now, it's not just one book, it's really 2 volumes. And if you can get it from either Edwin Vieira, Pieces of Eight, or you can get on get on the internet and look for somebody that's trying to sell a copy, and I think that there's some copies of Edwin Vieira's book, Pieces of Eight, that's available. But in that work, Edwin lays out, you know, the complete history of the money issue in this country, I mean, in excruciating detail, starting off in the early 1700s, coming all the way forward to date. If you want to know something about the money issue, I would encourage you to read Pieces of Eight. But, you know, one of the things that we can do in this movement is something that relates to the legal battle. I'll give you some examples. Years ago, I ran into a guy by the name of Dane von Breikenbruchart. He was this guy that was operating a little organization called the United States Bill of Rights Foundation, usbor.org. That's a website. Dane was living in Washington, D.C. He's a lawyer. He was also a sharpshooter. And so he was real interested in the money issue. He came along after he formed this organization, United States Bill of Rights Foundation, and he wanted to find a place to live in Washington, D.C., and so he rented a house from a guy by the name of Dick Heller. Now let me tell you who Dick Heller is. Do y'all remember several years ago the United States Supreme Court came out with a Second Amendment decision? Heller against D.C. Y'all remember that case? Went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, hey, the Second Amendment is personal. Doesn't relate just solely to the militia. And it guarantees what we think of as our right to keep and bear arms as an individual right. That's what the Heller case decided. Now let me tell you how we got into that position. You know, if you'd asked me in the late 80s, late 90s, or any time in the 90s, even in the early 2000s, you know, what my view would be of how the courts would really construe and give teeth to the Second Amendment, I would have said, well, they're probably going to do something less than they did in the Heller decision. But what happened in the Heller decision? Dane and Dick got together. They knew that there's something needed to be done about the gun control laws in Washington, D.C. They went through the right fact pattern to raise the issue of the constitutional validity of the gun ban in Washington, D.C. You know, for example, what they did in Dick Heller's case is they had Dick run down and approach the public officials in the District of Columbia and try to register a handgun. And of course they denied him, and that gave him standing to challenge the constitutionality of those D.C. gun laws. There were some other parties that got involved. You know, back around 2003, 2004, you know, the Second Amendment crowd was making a decision. Hey, we need to make a constitutional attack against the restrictive gun laws in Washington, D.C. Ultimately, that resulted in a number of lawsuits being filed. Dick Heller was one of the parties, along with a whole bunch of other parties. Well, they filed the lawsuit in Washington, D.C., got shot down there. They go up on appeal to the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, and from there they went to the United States Supreme Court. And do we not have something that's incredibly beneficial in that effort by the Second Amendment crowd to come along and institute a lawsuit to challenge the constitutionality of the D.C. gun ban? That's in effect what it was. And look at the results. How many of you are familiar with the Heller decision? Raise your hand. Well, for those of you that haven't, you know, I'm just telling you what it is. You know, the Heller decision was real important. Following along on the Heller decision, once the Heller decision came out, I think that there might have been at most a day that elapsed between here the Heller decision comes out and a lawsuit being filed in Chicago, the McDonald case. The McDonald case raised the constitutionality of Chicago's gun ban. And that case, you know, here we had Heller decided, the McDonald case from the Seventh Circuit challenging the constitutionality of the Chicago gun ban. It also went to the United States Supreme Court. And there, the United States Supreme Court, you know, Heller dealt with just, you know, something that's going in the nation's capital. Where? That's in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 jurisdiction. You know, the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Well, the next logical thing that had to be done was now let's take on a state or a city, you know, that has a real restrictive gun ban and see what rights we have regarding the Second Amendment inside the states. Well, that Chicago case, it also went to the United States Supreme Court, McDonald against Chicago, and the Supreme Court came out and said, hey, look, here's what we said in the Heller case, and now we're saying that the Second Amendment applies to the states, and the Second Amendment protection that's embodied in the Second Amendment, you know, the protection afforded the citizen, the population, in reference to the Second Amendment at the federal level is now also applicable to the states. So I just simply note this. One prong of this battle does indeed involve litigation in courts. And a lot of people, you know, even Steve was making some comments about, you know, gee, we can't get any place in the courts. No, if you sit down and you plan things, I think we can. You know, the condition of the courts, their protection of the system, hey, that's just, you know, the sun rises in the east, and our lives are centered around the fact that the sun rises in the east. You know, the fact that the courts have a certain condition, that's just a fact of life. And it has a direct relationship to how we engage in litigation. Now, you know, I make a direct comparison between engaging in litigation and, you know, other activities of the movement. As I told you earlier this morning, I got involved with the movement in 1979 when I ran into Tupper Saucy. You know, a good friend of mine is John Kottmeyer, who runs an organization called Save a Patriot Fellowship. You know, I've known John since 1984. John's a good friend of mine, but I disagree with him in certain respects. And John's approach has been, well, let's just be good foot soldiers and just hang in there. And the way we're going to bring about favorable change is we're just going to hang in there and convince our friends and neighbors that they got to come over to our side. Well, that process of educating the masses, I've got three decades under my belt, and I've seen the movement, be small at times, and I've seen the movement large at times. The most recent time that it was large was during the activities of Ron Paul running for president. And but even now that that's died down, the movement kind of contracts. So there's an ebb and flow inside the movement. But I'm telling you that what I've observed over 3 decades, this process of going out and trying to convince our friends and neighbors to come on over our side, it really it's open-ended when we're going to reach a conclusion. And so that's something while it is important for us to get out there and spread the word and talk to people, I just simply observe this fact. When do we achieve a goal using that method? When do we reach a milestone? And while we need to continue that, I do think that there's a lot of things that can be done through litigation, and an example of that is what happened with the Second Amendment cases here that we've all seen in the last 4 and 5 years. Now, having said that, let me introduce John Green. John, I want you to introduce yourself a little bit more than I do. John Green is an old cop from Houston. Right?
Not that old.
Well. But he went to law school. He became a Texas lawyer. I've always thought of him as somebody from Louisiana. But here recently, this Texan moved to the Northwest. And now he lives at elevation, 35,000 feet?
2,700.
Okay, all right. And they have snow there right now?
Yes.
Okay. But John is one of these committed patriots. He's been involved in the fight for a long time. The guy that was in the back of the room, our farmer from Athens, Tom Suglas, who left because his wife called him, he won't make a presentation. But in lieu thereof, we've got John Green, and I think John has just now completed loading a money issue presentation. Is that it?
Well, if I'm going to do mine and Tom's, I got to kind of combine them. So,
okay, good enough.
So how much time do I have?
Well, we're going to be finishing the meeting. How many people here